Hey guys. Thanks for checking out this channel. I'm Jeffrey. I'll be narrating this intro. If you're interested in seeing animations like me, stay tuned. Today, we are introducing you to 7 serial killers who are currently deceased, like me. Feel free to skip ahead to 1 minute 20 seconds to get into the meat of this content. Feel free to check this video's chapters out if you're interested in learning about one specific person. Today we're briefly covering Peter Kurten, Fritz Haarmann, Karl Grossmann, Adolf Seefeldt, Ted Bundy, myself, and John Wayne Gacy. If you like educational true crime content and want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. Feel free to comment and share this video as well. The more people view this, the more time I can dedicate to creating content in the future. It's amazing how far technology has advanced. I'm hoping to learn how to deepfake images and videos and create realistic deepfaked voices through GANs. And now for the main content. Thanks for your patience.
Peter Kurten. Also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. He was active in the Dusseldorf area between 1913 and 1929. He drank the blood of several of his victims and engaged in bestiality. Kurten had a terrible childhood. He grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with alcoholic and abusive parents. Kurten's father had been charged with serious crimes as well. He committed at least 9 murders and attempted at least 31 more of them. He was a petty thief, an arsonist, a deviant, and committed his first murders in early childhood. He eventually allowed his wife to turn him in after he confessed to being the Vampire of Dusseldorf. She collected the reward for his capture and he was executed in 1931. The Sadist by Dr. Carl Berg was based on his interviews with Kurten, and the film M is inspired by Kurten's killing spree. Fritz Haarmann, the Butcher of Hanover, aka the Wolf Man. Fritz lived from 1879 until his execution in 1925. He is accused of committing between 24 and 27 murders. He was nicknamed the Butcher of Hanover because of his brutality toward his victims and his habit of biting through his victims' throats. As a young adult, Fritz found success in the military. He enrolled in a military academy but was discharged for lapses of consciousness and epilepsy-like episodes. He began preying on young boys after his military discharge and was sentenced to a mental institution. Medical professionals deemed him incurably deranged. He was initially sentenced to the mental institution indefinitely, but his mother helped him escape to Zurich, Switzerland. Shortly after, he returned to Hanover, married, had a child, and was drafted into the military again. He was seen as a model soldier but was discharged due to possible dementia praecox, or schizophrenia. After his second military discharge, he returned to Hanover and worked at his father's cigar factory. For the next decade, Fritz lived as a con man, petty thief, and con artist. Fritz spent most of the time between 1905 to 1912 in jail. In 1913, he was arrested for a series of burglaries. The police used Fritz Haarmann as a police informant, knowing his background as a criminal and homosexual. Between 1918 and 1924, Fritz committed at least 24 murders of boys and young men in the Hanover area. He lured young men to his house with the promise of food, drink, and a place to stay. The majority of his victims were runaways or neglected youth who were found at Hanover Station. Haarmann had a companion named Hans Granz who lived with Haarmann but didn't participate in his crimes directly. Granz sought Haarmann out, hoping to prostitute himself to meet his needs. Haarmann appeared to care for Granz, who turned a blind eye to Haarmann's activities. This video is an overview. I will give you more information in the Haarmann documentary. After a little while, police began finding human bones disposed of in the Lena River. After this discovery, suspicion fell on Haarmann quickly, who had been given too much power and freedom due to his role as a criminal informant. They began watching Haarmann and eventually arrested him in 1924. Upon arrest and sentencing, Haarmann asked the judicial system to spare Hans Granz, who was eventually sentenced to death as well. Granz served 12 years, was sent to a concentration camp, and then lived in Hanover until his death in 1975. Fritz Haarmann was beheaded on April 15, 1925. Karl Grossmann. Also known as the Berlin Butcher. He lived from 1863 to 1922 in Berlin, Germany. His killing spree took place between 1918 and 1921, and he committed anywhere from 26 to over 100 murders. He was also charged with sexual offenses in these cases, but he committed suicide before he went to trial. The police never received a full confession of his crimes. There are still a lot of unknowns when it comes to Grossmann's murders. Before his killing spree, he had several convictions for child molestation. Grossmann was eventually arrested in his apartment after neighbors became alarmed by the screams and noise coming from his residence. Neighbors saw a large number of women entering his apartment but never saw anyone leaving. A 1922 report claims he confessed to 4 murders but may have been responsible for more. Adolf Seefeldt, also known as the Sandman. He was a German serial killer who lived from 1870 to 1936. Throughout his life, he lived in the northeastern part of Germany and eventually died in the city of Schwerin. He was abused at the age of 12 and eventually was arrested for abusing a youth in adulthood. He killed or abused at least 12 boys during the reign of the Third Reich in Germany. His victims, often dressed in sailor suits, appeared to be sleeping peacefully and could easily be mistaken for natural deaths. He was accused of poisoning, drugging, and smothering his victims. Once his victims were out, he sexually abused them and left them to die of hypothermia. The victims' ages ranged from toddlers to preteens. He was eventually convicted and was eager to be executed by the guillotine. Ted Bundy was a serial killer who lived from 1946 to 1989. He attacked, kidnapped, and murdered young women. He confessed to 30 homicides, but his real victim count could be even higher. Bundy had a charismatic personality and would feign weakness or injury in order to overpower his victims. He engaged in sick activities with deceased bodies and took mementos from his crimes. While in jail in Utah, he became a suspect in additional killings. He then faced murder charges in Colorado and escaped to Florida, where he committed several more. He was eventually executed by the state of Florida in 1989. He had some issues with his family growing up, attended college, worked on Nelson Rockefeller's campaign, and worked for a suicide hotline. Eventually, he enrolled in law school but spiraled and started killing women shortly after. I don't have time to go over all of his crimes, but he committed a lot of them. His escapes from prison were notable, along with the fact that he defended himself in his murder trials. Bundy later helped profilers understand the minds of other serial killers, such as the Green River Killer. Bundy committed crimes all over the U.S., which made him harder to track down. Jeffrey Dahmer lived between 1960 and 1994. He was a serial killer, a cannibal, a sex offender, and an alcoholic. He was convicted of the murder and dismemberment of 17 boys and young men between 1978 and 1991. He was known to preserve body parts and kept most of his victims' bones. Dahmer was murdered by another inmate at the age of 34. Dahmer grew up in Northeast Ohio, where he committed his first murder at the age of 18. His dark fantasies became intertwined with his interest in dissecting dead animals, and eventually people. Shortly after puberty, Dahmer realized he was gay. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, he picked up hitchhiker Stephen Hicks and strangled the 19-year-old to death. Hicks's body was buried in Dahmer's backyard in Bath Township, Ohio. That fall, Dahmer attended Ohio State but flunked out after 1 semester due to his alcoholism. Dahmer left OSU with a 0.45 GPA and decided to enlist in the United States Army. Eventually, he was discharged again due to his alcoholism. His family sent Dahmer to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, so he could turn his life around. He found employment in Wisconsin but was arrested for indecent exposure shortly after. While working at a chocolate factory, Dahmer began involving himself in the gay scene in Milwaukee. His desire to control and possess his victims began to grow. In the mid-80s, Dahmer began drugging fellow bathhouse patrons and was eventually barred from entering. By 1986, Dahmer was arrested for a sexual offense involving 12-year-old boys. After this arrest, Dahmer began killing more regularly. He started drugging and strangling his victims, mostly men he met at gay bars and male prostitutes. In the fall of 1988, Dahmer's grandmother forced him to move out because of his excessive drinking, the parade of strange men coming to her house, and the presence of foul smells coming from her basement and garage. In 1989, Jeffrey was arrested for enticing a child for sexual purposes. In 1990, he moved into the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee after his arrest. This apartment complex was close to his work at a chocolate factory but was in a sketchy area. The apartment gave Dahmer more freedom to lure in victims and the privacy needed to hide their bodies. After drugging victims, he took pictures of their bodies. In 1991, he poured hydrochloric acid into a victim's skull. Dahmer wanted to turn his victims into permanently compliant, submissive zombies. This zombie plan would fail, so he ended up strangling his victims and saving parts of their bodies. In 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was almost caught by the police, but was wrongfully let go. He held a 14-year-old Laotian teen captive and attempted to drug him, drill a hole into his skull, and pour hydrochloric acid into that hole. The next day the teen escaped and was found on a street corner bleeding out of his backside and frantically speaking in Lao. Several women came across the teen and called the police. Dahmer tried to take the teen back to his home, claiming he was his intoxicated lover. The police arrived and Dahmer convinced them the teen acted like this when he was drunk. The police ignored the women's concerns and gave the boy back to Dahmer. Dahmer eventually killed the 14-year-old. Unfortunately, this incident was only classified as a domestic dispute by the police. 2 policemen returned to the scene later on and one of them noticed a foul stench coming from Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer killed a few more people before his arrest in July 1991. One of Dahmer's potential victims noticed his foul-smelling apartment while he was being held captive, along with several boxes of hydrochloric acid. This led him to contact the police after Dahmer told him he was going to eat his heart. The handcuffed victim led police to Dahmer's apartment where they found Polaroid pictures of dead bodies along with some body parts. His trial began in 1992 and he was convicted on all charges. In 1994, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver beat him to death with a metal bar. John Wayne Gacy. An American serial killer and sex offender who lived from 1942 to 1994. Also known as Pogo the Clown or the Killer Clown. He committed his murders in his ranch home located in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. Gacy would typically lure a victim to his home and dupe them into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. Gacy would then essay and torture his captives before he killed them. Most commonly he used asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote to kill the young men. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. 4 more were discarded in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was convicted of sodomy in 1968, committed his first murder in 1972 and was sentenced to death in 1980. Gacy killed at least 33 people. His killing spree took place between 1972 and 1978. He was executed in 1994. Gacy's father was an abusive alcoholic who constantly belittled him. After Gacy reached adulthood, he worked at a mortuary and eventually managed several KFC stores in Waterloo, Iowa. After his release from jail, Gacy returned to Chicago. Gacy worked as a line cook and started a part-time construction business. The young men hired by Gacy's construction company were easy prey. Some of Gacy's victims were lured with job offers, drugs, and money. Other times, Gacy's victims were taken by force. His victims would often fall for his handcuff trick. In 1978, one of Gacy's victims was attacked and was left unconscious in Chicago's Lincoln Park. He later came to his senses, remembering some of the details from his attack. He identified Gacy's Oldsmobile as his attacker's car, which was then followed back to Gacy's residence. By 1978 he started running out of space in the crawlspace of his home, so he began throwing victims in the Des Plaines River. Gacy's final murder, Robert Piest, who was interested in a job working for Gacy, eventually led to his arrest. Gacy met with Piest, who was killed shortly after their meeting. When Piest was declared missing, it led police straight to Gacy. After this, a search warrant was issued for Gacy's home. The police began their surveillance of Gacy and eventually obtained another warrant. Gacy eventually confessed to over 30 murders and told police where he disposed of Piest's body. Gacy was tried and convicted of 33 murders. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On May 9, 1994, Gacy was executed. 5 of Gacy's victims still remain unidentified. When he initially confessed, he asked if his associates were also arrested. Police, defense attorneys, and investigators feel there's evidence Gacy didn't act alone. There is a rumor that some of his PDM, construction, employees assisted in some of these cases.